Every time we made a mistake, we would always count the experiences and lessons learned and move on.
Today, I am pleased to have as my guest Hugh Kelly, co-founder and CEO of Simply Blue Energy.
The climate crisis, it's here, it's happening, it will come back around, and it will come back around stronger. And those who have the courage to get into it now are going to be the leaders in the sector in the future.
Welcome to another episode of Excellence in Global Offshore Wind. I'm your host, Philip Bassil. Today, I am pleased to have as my guest Hugh Kelly, co-founder and CEO of Simply Blue Energy. On this episode, we focus on the resiliency and evolution of an entrepreneurial organization and a leading offshore wind developer. Simply Blue Energy is currently one of the most talked about developers in the sector, particularly following the recent landmark acquisition by Japan's KEPCO, Kansai Electric Power Company, of an 80% stake in the offshore wind arm of the business. Hugh is a civil engineer by training and a serial entrepreneur who has sold everything from concrete Christmas tree stands to ferry doors before co-founding Simply Blue in 2011. This pioneering spirit is exactly what led them to move into floating wind long before it was mainstream. Hugh, welcome.
Thank you, Philip. Delighted to be here.
You have one of the most dynamic entrepreneurial backgrounds in our industry, from civil engineering to selling over 250,000 ferry doors and timber frames. How did a scrappy startup mentality prepare you to lead an offshore wind developer working on multi-billion-dollar projects?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I guess from everything you do, you gain unique insights and experience, maybe a bit more courage. And of course, you make a few mistakes along the way. Myself and a good friend from college, Sam Roach Perks, who I think you've met as well, Philip, and you'll agree is an inspirational character himself. He came to me in 2011 and he said, we've been doing things together on the side. Both of us had our own businesses. I was involved in helping companies grow their export or business acceleration, if you like. He was deep into property development. So two skills that would serve us well ultimately in Simply Blue, where you grow through partnership and there's an element of property development. But we'd done lots of things together on the side of our businesses. He wasn't involved in the ferry doors or in our pet treats business selling pig's ears, or even in our medical devices or construction products. But we had looked at coffee shops in India, and we'd looked at a restaurant in Singapore and a home bar company. But in 2011, we said, look, let's actually do something serious here. We both had families and children, and we both had a keen interest in the environment and the growing climate crisis. And he came to me with news of a technology, a wave energy technology he'd come across in Sweden. And he said, maybe this is what we should do together and really apply ourselves. So we did. We launched into it. We brought the same entrepreneurial spirit that we had before. In other words, lots of energy, but not enough research. And we started on our journey. Now, in due course, we learned that wave technology wasn't quite ready. So we had spent some time, perhaps some would say wasted time, but it always reminds me of a story I read in a book by Lee Iacocca. He was let go from Ford and then joined Chrysler and turned it around. And in his book, he tells a story of a young executive who walks into his office with a letter in his hand and put the letter on his desk. And Lee asked, what's the letter? And he said, that's my letter of resignation. He said, I've just lost $1 million on a project that went wrong. And Lee picked up the letter and threw it back at him and said, you've got to be kidding, he said. I've just spent $1 million on your education. So every time we made a mistake, we would always count the experiences and lessons learned and move on. Now, we did continue with wave energy, but what we did also was we pivoted into floating wind, having met some really interesting people in Cornwall, where we had looked at Wave Hub and looked at developing our first wave farm. And those connections and those stakeholders and those interested parties led us to discover the opportunity in floating wind, which was emerging at the time. And we said, this is an area we can carve our niche in. Bottom fixed is well established, solar is well established, but this is something that needs new players because people are developing the technology and that takes time. But projects, the customers, they also take time to develop. So if we start now, we should be ready customers for the technology when it's ready. So we realized that our ambitions were wider than just wave energy, and we developed the Simply Blue Group as a blue economy project developer. And we also then went into aquaculture, we went into CDR, we went into tidal, we went into sustainable aviation fuels. These are long-term projects. These are ambitious projects. One never knows which is going to work out. So we'd like to spread our effort because we saw the fight against climate change and now increasingly the fight for energy security as well. We saw it as one that would need to be fought on many fronts.
It's a fascinating journey, Hugh. I mean, I grew up around an entrepreneurial family as well. And you're right, I do know Sam, and we have similar backgrounds on the real estate side as well. But it's fascinating. Tell me about the early days of getting into floating offshore wind at Simply Blue Group. What were some of the early markets that you focused on in some of the early projects?
So out of our investigations into WaveHub, we came across a test and demonstration system in the UK that hadn't been used, and it allowed you to secure a bilateral lease for a project of up to 100 megawatts in the Celtic. And we identified when we took a developer-led approach, it wasn't plan-led at that stage. It was still up to developers to find sites. And we looked around and we found a great site off Pembroke, a site that we now, in a project we call Erebus, named after a ship that was built in Pembroke. It was one of the last Arctic explorers and Antarctic explorers that was driven by sail. So we thought we'll call our project after Erebus. It's got lovely connections to Milford Haven. And we applied to the Crown Estate for one of these unusual test and demonstration leases. And we were successful ultimately in August 2020 in securing that lease. That's what led us to develop the project there. We did look at other markets as well. I mean, Ireland is our home market, and we saw great opportunity there as well. And we've expanded beyond that.
And congratulations. Let me be one of the first to say, obviously, Erebus recently was awarded a CFD in AR7. And that must have been a beautiful surprise and a proud moment for the whole team.
We started out, we were very small, and we needed to attract the best. And we also grew up during COVID. So huge to our growth was why we were doing what we were doing. So I think Simon Sinek, many of your listeners may have listened to his YouTube videos and everything else. And he says, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So it was very much our passion that we used as our leading edge in trying to attract talent, in trying to assemble a team, and in trying to keep it together and functioning during 2020, 21, 22, when there were times that we'd recruit somebody and it would be 6+ months before we'd actually meet them face to face. And yet we needed to create that bonding in the team. So it's very much about our passion, very much about why we were doing what we were doing.
Take us from, the early days to, the recent announcement, late last year with the partnership with Kansai.
Well, I mean, the early days, let me describe our first success in offshore wind. Lots of people think it was when we secured Total as a partner in Erebus. And indeed, that was a really important moment. But I always think our first success was actually securing the support of a financial advisor who came in to back us, and we managed to get going. And those were very, very important days. And securing then, finding people with vision like yourselves, Philip. I mean, I looked at your vision statement before I came onto this video because I talk about our, vision for future generations to be a good ancestor. And I saw in your one, it's a greener planet for future generations. And, those sort of, and having people like you in the industry are the enablers for people like us. And that was our first success, being able to get in there, secure a partner. And we grew from there. We grew other projects, other partnerships. Some succeeded, some failed, had to be replaced. Shell came into Ireland. Shell left Ireland. EDF are now our partners in Ireland. We partnered with Ørsted. Ørsted have unfortunately had some very challenging times recently. But it was about resilience. It was about growing our portfolio relentlessly. And it was about capturing learnings. And in the beginning of 2024, we went out to market to look for a partner, a new parent, because we had grown to such a size that we needed a stronger balance sheet behind us if we were going to realize what we wanted to do. I described it to Kansai when I met them, we needed a new champion. We need a new parent to back us. And it took 21 months. The Japanese are extremely deliberate. They are extremely thorough. And it gives us additional pride that we came through such a process. And at the end of October signed, and at the end of November closed our transaction with Kansai. So as I say to people now, I've got new parents, and they are Kansai Electric Power Company, perhaps either the second or the largest utility in Japan.
Congratulations. And of course, from
Thank you.
Kansai, David Pavel, a friend of mine, is now the chairman of Simply Blue Energy. So I think you'll enjoy working with him. He's a great guy.
He is. He brings huge experience, and it's not just money you look for when you're looking for a new parent. It's that sort of depth of experience and commitment to your industry.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thank you for the comments around, impact and our vision. I think we're very aligned on that, and the importance of, doing well, but also doing good, and then thinking ahead of the next generations and making an impact.
It's really, really important. I think I sometimes say to the team, I fear it's become woke to talk about climate change. And we all have to talk about energy security now. But for us, climate change and the biodiversity crisis is still just as important as energy security.
Well, one of the reasons we launched this podcast, and I'm glad you brought it up, is there's been what I call a lot of noise in the industry. And I think we need to get back to the signal. And if you, in a world where energy demand is growing significantly, especially with data centers and hyperscalers most recently, but electrification and other needs before that, that you really, from a business perspective, and just like you mentioned earlier with you and Sam, you really need the best alternatives. And cost is a big factor. So what's the cheapest form of electricity? It's actually renewable, right? It happens to be good for the environment, and that's a plus. But I think if you look at it, and now, especially in the world we live in, energy security has really gone up in terms of importance. So if you look at the fundamentals, everything points to renewable energy. If you want power in scale, especially to demand centers and load centers that are near the coast, places like Australia or others, big countries, you could build solar in the country, but really it's the coast. So plugging in, offshore wind in scale makes a lot of sense, for example. So I'm glad you bring that up, because it's really based on fundamentals, and that's what allows North Green Capital to make an impact. And as you mentioned, work with developers like yourselves, because the economics have to work. These have to be bankable projects. Pension funds and others that invest in the space need to see a return. It's good for the environment. That's also good, but you're really leading with bankable projects. So it's a good point you bring up, and I wanted to highlight that. So thank you.
In previous discussions, Philip, we've asked what is the biggest challenge to offshore wind, and why does it face resistance? And one of the issues, I think, is that the lack of understanding about what it can offer in terms of affordable renewable energy. Yes, floating at this stage is not cheap. But then solar was 1,000 times more expensive in 1972 than it was last year. These costs will come down, and offshore wind can provide the scale that's required to make a huge difference. One of the things that isn't understood, and is often misleading, is the comparisons with other forms of fuel. Nuclear has its place, but let's be honest, they don't count decommissioning costs when they're working at the levelized cost of energy. That's pretty significant with an industry that doesn't know how to get rid of its waste yet. Fossil fuels, the International Monetary Fund estimated that in 2022 or 2023, it received 7 trillion in subsidies globally that year. And people are shocked. They think, oh, I thought it was the cheapest form. But when you add up direct subsidies along with climate damage and what's not covered, those are the sort of figures you're talking about. Even in little old Ireland, it's 4.7 billion in 2023 was the amount of subsidies provided to fossil fuels. So yes, we need them. They have allowed the world to develop, but it is time to embrace renewables as far as we are concerned. That's certainly our vision.
And those are definitely elements that are less understood. And I think, the cost of fuel and as well as the CapEx and, adding the whole picture and comparing apples to apples is really important. And that's not to say we don't need other forms of energy. Of course, we're going to have gas for a long time. We need batteries. We need resiliency. So it is a form of, all the above in a sense, but you need to be, truthful when comparing, alternatives and really call it what it is, in terms of comparing apples to apples. So I agree with you. So I want to go back to Simply Blue Group because, I want to talk a bit about how you select sites. But first, Simply Blue Group started with a mindset of impact as well as obviously building a business. Tell us about how that's evolved into Simply Blue Energy, which is now your offshore wind division, if I understand correctly.
Yes, so the Simply Blue Group developed and developed projects in the different areas I mentioned earlier in wave and wind, and we looked at tidal. We also looked at CDR. We invested quite heavily in sustainable aviation fuel, speaking to the point you just made about the need for lots of different solutions. They haven't invented an airplane yet that can take off if it's powered by batteries. It's simply too heavy. So we need other solutions and we need to embrace them all. And aquaculture, salmon farming in Scotland is one of the biggest industries and biggest exports, but it faces huge challenges around disease and around waste. And we championed and are continuing to champion in one of our divisions the adoption of new salmon farming systems that could double the output of the Scottish salmon farming industry. That's impact. That's the sort of impact we chase. So what's happened now is that we obviously have a very big division in offshore wind, and we have separated that out from the other activities of Simply Blue Group. And I've gone with that, and I am leading the offshore wind division now under the parentage of Kansai, while Sam continues to work on our other and develop our other projects and work streams. We've moved our sustainable aviation fuel project. One of our core shareholders, Octopus, is now taking that to the next stage. That continues to progress. It's in Nova Scotia, in Canada, a project that I think you know quite well, Philip, and very ambitious. And we're hoping and we're watching as that continues to develop to plan. And it's going to be a really, really impactful project if it's successful. So our job is to start things off, to get them, to de-risk them, to bring them to the point where bigger pockets and bigger players can come in and bring them through to fruition, sometimes with our continued involvement, sometimes without. But our objective is to have made a difference, to have got those projects going, and to ultimately see impact made.
That makes a lot of sense, Hugh. You've built a multi-gigawatt pipeline across Ireland, UK, Portugal, US in the past. What is Simply Blue's filter, for a project? What makes you look at a patch of ocean and say, that's a Simply Blue site?
So that has evolved over the years. I mean, we are all aware of the changing political environment around us. Even the last week, I've yet to digest the impact of what's happening in the Middle East and in Iran on our industry. But globally, our sector has moved from developer-led, where we pick the sites, to plan-led. So that means that also, and for the same reason, we're very much looking at government commitments. And do we believe that that government is committed and that country is committed? Because all of our projects will span at least 3 different governments. They take 10 to 12 years to take from initiation to fruition, to operating. So we need to look long-term and take a long-term view. And so a lot of our focus at the moment is on the UK and Ireland, and indeed now on Japan as well, where there is a deep commitment to developing offshore wind and a proven track record. We were all beginning perhaps to lose a little bit of faith in the UK. AR5 was bitterly disappointing. For floating AR6, only backed one project in the end. But as you mentioned earlier, we were absolutely delighted to be one of two projects in the floating space, to secure a CFD in allocation round 7 on the 14th of January last. It was a long Christmas, but I was delighted with the outcome.
Absolutely. And maybe just on that, tell us a bit about the CFD that was awarded to that project in terms of tenor and pricing and strike price and so on.
So the CFD that's awarded is awarded at the highest price that was bid in AR7, and that came out as £216.49 in 2024 money, and that comes with a 20-year term, which is an increase from previous, which was 15 years, and that makes a huge difference. But the biggest impact it makes is the ability to engage meaningfully now with the supply chain that it has been dubious to date, that has been nervous, and they can look at our business case now and say, this is real, this is deliverable, and we're going to engage. And we are seeing dramatic change and as we knew, once you secure a CFD, the expectation was that supply chain would engage in a different way, and we've already seen that. We've had a very busy month and a half since the CFD award. And it's very heartening and very exciting.
Excellent. It's also very important, Hugh, for what you're doing for the broader industry, because floating, allows access, of course, to many, many sites that are not accessible by fixed bottom. And these early projects, this is a 100 megawatt project that's a test and demonstration site, will, to your point, solar came down, was 1,000 times more expensive, and came down significantly. So, one of the big factors in bringing the cost down will be floating. So it's great to see that supply chain is engaged and active in discussions there to make that real.
The potential now to just with this little project, it's little for offshore wind, it's still 90,000 plus homes it'll power, but just with this little project, there's probably going to be 700 direct jobs created during construction, 800 indirect jobs. That is maybe 600 to 700 million invested in the, up to that much invested or secured through it in the local economy.
We talk a lot about industrialization and commercialization when it comes to floating offshore wind. How do you see the price coming down over the next number of years for floating?
It's a good question. And it depends how bold governments are. The mandate and the mantra, I should say, that we have used and quoted many times the British government is that the cost will only come down with deployment, not with the simple passage of time. And 2 floating wind demonstrators is a great start. And it's also potentially a great start because it's staggered if there's another 2 or 3 in the next round and so on. But unless that follow through happens, the reduction in the price of floating will take longer. So it depends on how brave we are. The CFD was designed for a quasi-mature bottom-fixed sector. The CFD is not perhaps the best. It's the best we have, but it does have challenges in the fact that it asks us to compete against each other and price projects that we've never built before. So pricing them is inherently difficult. But it depends. The answer to that, Philip, your question, Philip, is unfortunately it depends. It depends on how aggressively and boldly government support the industry. But there's no reason to believe it can't drop as quickly and as significantly as bottom fixed with that support.
Have you selected your technology for this project?
We have a preferred technology. We've been working with them for quite a number of years now. We have a preferred turbine supplier as well. But we continue to work on developing those relationships and those contracts at the moment.
I want to go back to something you touched on. It sounds like your focus at Simply Blue Energy has narrowed to maybe more mature, and I guess more mature or more committed markets, I guess, if you include Japan. Tell us a bit about the status on the market in Japan. Of course, we saw the early win by one entity, and then that went away and came back. So give us an update on what's happening in Japan and maybe a little bit of the background, the history.
The history, as you know, is that in round one, all of the sites were picked up by one developer at a price that ultimately proved undeliverable. What's happening in Japan now is that those sites are coming back around to be re-auctioned, and that is giving a great momentum to the market. There was also a successful round three. They're starting with bottom fixed, but the majority of the seascape that's available for development in Japan is indeed going to be floating. And that's really where the excitement is beginning to build in Japan, as we're seeing processes beginning to roll out.
Is it correct that my understanding is that you're looking at fixed bottom and floating offshore wind at this point, as opposed to just floating more broadly across Simply Blue?
Correct. We're looking at a fixed bottom project in Ireland. We're looking at one in Canada. So we see both as being essential parts of the mix and a lot of the complementary skills. As I mentioned earlier, we were able to differentiate ourselves as floaters, but we would be foolish not to also take bottom fixed opportunities. And also because, the markets, there's not hundreds of markets at the moment. We were in America. When we saw the way the political winds were blowing, we left America. And in hindsight, we didn't leave too early. We were developing projects in Finland, really exciting project that had to be abandoned because the Ukraine war broke out. It goes to the long-term risks and the challenges in being a developer in offshore wind. You've got to spread your risk, and you've got to take very considered decisions about where to invest because the numbers are huge.
I want to shift a bit to strategy, Hugh. As we mentioned, in late 2025, KEPCO acquired an 80% stake in Simply Blue's offshore wind business. This was KEPCO's first direct management investment in an offshore wind developer. Why was KEPCO the right partner for your next chapter?
Well, the first thing and the most important thing with any partnership, whether it be project level or whether it be with a financial advisor, and it's something I learned from my previous experiences running a company that helped others to grow internationally through partnership, finding distributors or finding agents, is you need to match the culture. You've got to have a culture that gets on, that respects. And there was an immediate connection when we met the guys from Kansai. They're absolutely lovely people, and they share a lot of our values, and they're articulated in Kansai's own vision and mission statements. The other thing that's key, and again, going back to my previous experience, people would say, would you look for a partner who, going back to our ferry doors, was I looking for somebody who had the most number of salespeople or the biggest warehouse or the biggest balance sheet, or, were the most successful at selling ferry doors up until that point? And the key and the most important characteristic that characterizes any successful partnership is hunger. Do they really want to do this? Do they really believe in it? Because it doesn't matter if they don't have enough resources, they'll find them. If it's a matter of survival, and it's not in the case of Kansai, they're a massively successful company, but if they are passionate to make their division, this new division, succeed, then it will. So values, hunger, personality goes to values, and the commitment to look at us and do the due diligence. I mean, I can sleep at night now knowing that the best in the world have looked at under the bonnet and said, yeah, you're not doing too bad a job.
Absolutely. I mean, culture is very important, but you bring up a really interesting, again, entrepreneurial differentiator. It's really hunger, right? The hunger to sometimes you don't expect someone to succeed, but that hunger just drives them right through.
I think it's had an interesting influence. We've had chats. I remember having chats with one designer of a leasing round in an international market, and they were saying, how do you think we should design this round? We've observed what's happened in other countries, and in many cases, oil and gas, the big guys, they've swept them up, they've taken it, And I said, hunger. I said, you got to back the guys. And obviously I was promoting us. You got to back the guys whose life depends on delivering, not the guys who have enough to buy the option and then have a look and maybe.
I believe it's very much true. Hunger is a key ingredient. I have to ask this because some of our listeners might be wondering, what are fairy doors? And how do you sell 250,000 of them? Tell us how. Just a side note here, just in case someone's wondering.
Two wonderful couples that during the recession came up with this idea of these tiny little fairy doors, and that you put on your skirting board, and you'd leave a message outside, and in the morning the lease you'd left outside would be signed that included commitments not to put their washing in with the humans washing and to be good neighbors and everything like this. And these fairies were invisible, and they played to children's imagination, and it was wonderful. It was a wonderful story to sell. We went to Sweden with them, and they said, "Oh no, we do elves here. You're not going to be able to sell those here." But we gave a bunch of them out free to children, and it turns out 5-year-olds don't mind whether they're elves or they're fairies. They just have amazing imagination. And so we sold fairy doors from Sweden to Dubai. And it was great fun, bringing happiness.
Back to Kansai, the core objectives moving forward, was Kansai interested in Simply Blue because of the Japanese market, or are they looking to grow outside Japan in terms of ownership of offshore wind assets globally?
So we're very much that the current strategy is that Simply Blue is the European and Canadian development platform, that we are the project development part of the business. We not only bring projects, but we bring a super team. And we invested heavily in the last number of years in capturing those learnings, in setting up structures and digitizing what we do. And so we will also work hand in hand, the intention, with Kansai in Japan, working with their teams to develop projects in Japan and perhaps more widely in Asia. But initially, we've decided to focus on Europe and Canada and on collaboration in Japan.
Tell us about Ireland. Ireland has massive ambitions, but has faced significant regulatory and grid delays. As an Irish headquartered firm, how are you working with the government to ensure the Celtic Sea doesn't miss the 2030 window?
One of our team, Val Cummins, is well known in the industry and probably one of the most influential, and has been championing the marine for many, many years. And she leads our efforts with EDF in Ireland. And we are edging forwards. What we have in Ireland now is a new clearinghouse established by the Taoiseach, which is our Prime Minister, to try and overcome some of those hurdles that you mentioned, Philip. Consent or planning is a big problem in Ireland, and now concrete steps are being taken to shortcut the process so that it's not so easy to stop very good and nationally significant projects going ahead. Not to just let anything go through, but very good nationally significant projects that can prove themselves should not be unnecessarily held up. And we're seeing the phase 1 projects on the East Coast, they're bottom fixed projects. We don't have any of them, we're not involved in any of them, but we are seeing those progressing now through the planning. And that is really, really encouraging. We've also had a successful auction of what's called the Tom Nua site, a 900 megawatt site on the South Coast in the Irish Celtic Sea. And a commitment from government that before the end of 2027 and as soon as possible, they will auction the next site there, Libon. We're also seeing them turning their attention to the challenge of grid because, we are a small country. Our grid services what we need. But to tap the potential that we have offshore in Ireland. I mean, offshore Ireland is 8 times the size of terrestrial Ireland. And somebody told me we're actually the second largest country in Europe. I'm not sure if that's true, but I'll take it. It's a good dinner party story. When you count our seabed. And we've been blessed with a seabed that is ideal depth for floating. Not too deep, but too deep for fixed, but not too deep for floating.
What's the range on depth there?
Traditionally, we sort of assume that fixed goes up to a maximum of about 60 meters. Now, with new technologies, deep fixed is emerging and it may go deeper, maybe 80 meters. But an awful lot of the west coast of Ireland is 200 meters plus. But you're not going as deep as a kilometer or anything like that. 200 to 500 meters. And that is very, very manageable and ideal actually for floating.
The grid, we've seen this in multiple markets, in many markets, almost all the markets, where it's a chicken and egg problem, where the grid has been built to a certain extent, but it doesn't have the additional capacity to connect new load or new generation. How do you see markets dealing with that question around the chicken and egg, around the grid? Are there solutions out there that you've seen in markets that have done it really well?
I'm not sure that any market has done it really well yet. The UK is obviously attractive because they can still offer grid connections, but they have their challenges in Scotland, for example, for the INTOG projects and for the ScotWind projects. Investment is simply required, and perhaps the development of private wire, for example, in Ireland, private wire legislation to allow us to connect directly to large energy users. But we simply have to confront this. The investment has to be made. Grid is the limiting factor at the moment, and that has to be addressed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we hear a lot about no transition without transmission, right? So the grid is definitely a key bottleneck in this equation. So if we shift to early versus late stage nuances, I've seen developers struggle to bridge the what we call the valley of death between early stage permits and the FID, the final investment decision. How has the financing structure of offshore wind changed now that we are in a higher for longer interest rate environment, in your view?
Well, in terms of what we do, what we've seen is joint ventures going from being perhaps two-party to multi-party as a pragmatic way of spreading the risk between projects and between partners. In terms of then raising finance at FID for construction, none of our projects have gone quite that far yet. But the early engagement we've had with banks and finance providers has been encouraging. But they're looking for, in the past there was the bar was quite low. FOMO again was kicking in. I think what we're seeing is just the discipline coming into the market. In terms of the increasing cost of interest, well, that's why the CFD and AR7 is so encouraging in the UK. It's a realization that these things, that the costs of delivering this in the short term will be very high.
What is it that you think, allowed the UK government to have that component of the AR7 for floating offshore wind at this stage?
I think we lobbied heavily. I mean, us and many others lobbied heavily for it, and we did open book. For the industry to succeed, one of the key partnerships is between government and industry and civil society. And government needed to listen to industry. We could characterize AR5 perhaps as a moment in time when they didn't listen to industry. We opened our books. There was a suspicion we were trying to make too much money, perhaps. I don't know. There were other political forces at play. But what AR7 demonstrated is that partnership beginning to work again between government and industry.
Absolutely, and it sounds like they've seen the value of the economic benefits and the job creation as well as the long-term development and evolution of the floating offshore wind industry as well.
Well, I'm told that there are Cornish tin miners still advising tin miners all over the world. There isn't a Cornish tin mine left open, but they're still advising them And they seize that first mover advantage. And I think that there are some visionaries in the UK who realize the opportunity in the Western Hemisphere, at any rate, for the UK to take a leadership position in offshore wind and in floating in particular.
As the last 24 months have been a reality check for our industry, how do you maintain a coherent and aligned team vision when projects get delayed by years due to planning or grid issues outside your control? How do you keep, as a leader, your team motivated and aligned with the vision?
It's difficult, but I think the passion that they have for what they're doing. What we've also done is, I mentioned that we had invested quite heavily in capturing our learnings internally and in digitizing them and formularizing what we do to reduce risk. Because any small percentage reduction in risk you can achieve in infrastructure projects our size can turn into millions or even 10 millions of savings. So we've deployed people that way when they are maybe less busy on a project. But again, to revert to a point I made previously, we grew up during COVID. We're not terribly bound geographically to where we are, and that makes our team very flexible. Somebody in Spain is perfectly happy to work on a project in Ireland if it's busier than their project at the moment. There are certain skills that aren't transferable. We need local stakeholders to be local. But when it comes to technical or even project management, there's plenty of opportunity to work remotely and to move resources around. But we have had to, downsize at times. We've had to do that because it was the right thing to do. And other times we've had to grow. I mean, it has been up and down like the industry. We have to react to the external environment.
And so on that note, for the young engineers or entrepreneurs listening to us, who see the headlines about the industry headwinds, what's the one reason they should still, bet their career on offshore wind, the ecosystem?
And I'm going to give you two reasons. One is because it matters. It matters so much. This matters. And, the climate crisis it's here, it's happening. I did a thesis back in 1990 in my final year in college on global warming and on the greenhouse effect and the impact on the rise in mean sea levels. At the time, there wasn't enough research to reach a consensus. So my challenge from my professor was to go out and collate all the research that was available at the time, see if there was a consensus opinion or what would be. And since then, I've tracked how things have gone, and they have gone exactly as the consensus predicted. In fact, they're getting worse now. So the need exists. So therefore, we need people, we need young people in it, and they're going to be plenty busy. The second thing I would say is when you're disheartened and you look at the downturn in jobs, or maybe it's not doing so well at the moment, or certain political leaders are very negative about your sector. There's a lovely story I heard once about Genghis Khan. Apparently he employed a gentleman to sit beside him. And whether he had just won a battle and was celebrating, or was reflecting over a defeat, this gentleman's only job was to whisper in his ear, "It won't always be this way." So it won't always be this way. It will come back around, and it will come back around stronger. And those who have the courage to get into it now are going to be the leaders in the sector in the future.
I think on that note, that's a great note to end, Hugh. I want to thank you very much for a really engaging conversation. Your passion comes through. Thank you for, the impact that you're making on the industry, including in floating. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you for having me on.